In the autumn of 663, a fleet from the Japanese archipelago entered the waters near the southwestern coast of the Korean peninsula. It had not come for trade. It had not come for ceremony. It had come to save a kingdom that officially no longer existed. That kingdom was Baekje. 3 years earlier, Baekje's capital had fallen to the combined forces of Tang China and Silla. Its king had surrendered. Its royal family and leading elites had been taken away. Its court had collapsed. On paper, the kingdom was finished. But history does not always end when a palace gate opens to the enemy. In the mountains, fortresses, river valleys, and surviving local strongholds of the old kingdom, Baekje loyalists kept fighting. They did not accept that the fall of the capital had to mean the death of the country. They needed a royal figure, a banner, a reason for men to keep risking their lives after the state itself had been declared dead. So they turned to a prince who had been living across the sea in Yamato Japan. His name was Baekje. The plan was desperate, but not irrational. Restore a Baekje prince. Hold the remaining fortresses. Bring in Japanese support. Break the siege. Rebuild the kingdom before Tang and Silla could finish absorbing it. That hope ended at Baekje. The battle that followed is often remembered as a naval clash. Baekje restoration forces and Yamato Japan on one side, Tang China and Silla on the other. But it was more than a battle between ships. It was a struggle over the future shape of East Asia. Tang wanted to project imperial power across the sea and into the peninsula. Silla wanted to destroy an old rival and open the path toward domination of Korea. Baekje loyalists wanted to reverse a conquest that had already taken their king and capital. Yamato Japan wanted to preserve a partner whose fall would change the balance across the sea. Baekje and Yamato lost. The fleet was broken. The restoration movement collapsed. Baekje fled. Baekje never returned as an independent kingdom. And yet Baekje did not simply disappear. It vanished from the political map, but not from memory. It remained in the ruins of Gongju and Buyeo. It remained in the early history of Japan. It remained in the story of how Korea's 3 kingdoms came to an end and how the powers of East Asia learned that allies could become rivals as soon as the enemy was gone. This is not the story of a weak kingdom being swallowed by stronger neighbors. It is the story of a maritime kingdom that survived for centuries by building connections across the sea, only to be trapped between Tang China, Silla, and Yamato Japan at the moment those connections mattered most. It is also the story of what a country loses after conquest, not only its capital, not only its king, but the right to decide what its own fall meant. Before Baekje fell, it was not a marginal state. It was one of the 3 kingdoms of Korea, standing alongside Goguryeo in the north and Silla in the southeast. For centuries, these 3 states competed, allied, betrayed, expanded, retreated, and rebuilt themselves around the hard geography of the peninsula. Baekje's heartland lay in the west and southwest. That mattered. Goguryeo looked toward Manchuria, mountain fortresses, northern frontiers, and the military world of the northeast. Silla, for much of its early history, grew in the more enclosed southeastern corner of the peninsula. Baekje faced the Yellow Sea. It looked west toward the Chinese mainland and south across the water toward the Japanese archipelago. Geography made Baekje a connector. It received influence from Chinese dynasties. It transmitted Buddhism, artisanship, writing culture, architecture, and political models across the sea to early Japan. It fought on the peninsula, but it also lived through maritime diplomacy. Its identity was never only local. It was Korean, coastal, diplomatic, and outward-facing. That outward-facing position helped Baekje survive. It also made Baekje vulnerable. The kingdom had already suffered a major trauma before its final fall. In the 5th century, pressure from Goguryeo forced Baekje to abandon its earlier northern center near the Han River basin. The loss of that region was not simply a military setback. It meant the loss of one of the most valuable strategic and economic zones on the peninsula. Baekje moved its capital south, first to Ungjin, today's Gwangju, later to Sabi, today's Buyeo. A capital is never just a cluster of buildings. It is a statement about where a state believes its future lies. By moving south, Baekje was not just escaping danger. It was redesigning itself around a new political and geographical reality. From Sabi, Baekje cultivated a refined court culture. It maintained diplomatic channels. It became closely associated with the spread of Buddhism and continental culture to Japan. Later Japanese traditions remembered Baekje not as a distant stranger, but as a vital source of learning, prestige, and connection to the wider world. That is why Baekje's fall would hit Yamato Japan differently from the fall of an ordinary foreign state. For Yamato, Baekje was not merely a neighbor across the water. It was part of the political and cultural network through which early Japan understood the continent. Baekje elites, envoys, monks, craftsmen, and texts had crossed the sea for generations. The relationship was uneven, complex, and not always easy to define, but it was real. Still, old relationships do not guarantee survival. By the 7th century, Baekje's world had changed. Tang China had reunified much of the Chinese world and inherited the strategic problems of earlier dynasties in the northeast. Silla was no longer a confined southeastern kingdom. Goguryeo remained powerful, but its strength also made it the focus of Tang attention. Every state in the region was making calculations. Every alliance had an expiration date. Baekje still had options. It could use diplomacy. It could lean on old maritime ties. It could exploit rivalry between bigger powers. But the space for maneuver was narrowing. The same sea that once connected Baekje to allies would soon become the route by which enemies and rescuers arrived at the same battlefield. Baekje and Silla were not always enemies. In earlier centuries, they had at times cooperated against Goguryeo. That was not unusual. In the politics of the Korean Three Kingdoms, survival often required temporary alliances. A state could fight one neighbor, ally with another, and then reverse the arrangement when the balance changed. But alliances built on fear rarely survive success. The central issue was the Han River Basin. Whoever controlled the Han River held a strategic prize: farmland, population, transport routes, and access to the middle of the peninsula. For Baekje, the region carried deep historical significance. It had once been central to Baekje's power. Losing it wounded the kingdom. Watching Silla benefit from the shifting balance made that wound worse. Silla understood the same geography from the opposite side. If Silla wanted to become more than a southeastern kingdom, it had to break out. It needed access, legitimacy, and allies. It could not remain permanently boxed in by Baekje, Goguryeo, and the sea. Its rulers saw that the road to survival might require a dangerous bargain with a much larger power. That power was Tang China. Tang had its own reasons to intervene. Goguryeo had resisted Chinese imperial pressure for generations. Campaigns against Goguryeo were difficult, expensive, and uncertain. Mountain fortresses, harsh terrain, and experienced defenders made the northern kingdom a hard target. If Tang wanted to reshape the peninsula, it needed partners. Silla needed Tang. Tang could use Silla. This was not a simple story of a small kingdom obeying a great empire. Silla's diplomacy was more active than that. It was a calculated gamble. By aligning with Tang, Silla could strike Baekje first, then help bring pressure against Goguryeo. If it worked, Silla might remove two rivals that had constrained it for centuries. But the bargain was dangerous. Great powers rarely lend armies for free. Tang did not cross the sea and commit troops simply so Silla could become master of Korea. The Tang court had its own imperial vision. It expected submission, order, and influence. Once Baekje and Goguryeo were gone, Tang and Silla would have to answer a question they could postpone during war: who would control the peninsula after victory? Baekje was caught before that later conflict emerged. From Baekje's point of view, the danger was tightening from multiple directions. Tang could attack by sea. Silla could push from the east. Goguryeo, though hostile to both Tang and Silla, could not be relied upon to save Baekje. The old triangular politics of the peninsula had become something larger and more dangerous. Baekje had survived for centuries by balancing powers. Now the balance itself was turning against it. There are moments in history when a state still appears to have choices, but every choice has already been narrowed by decisions made elsewhere. Baekje could defend its capital. It could trust its generals. It could call upon allies. It could hope that Tang and Silla would fail to coordinate. But hope is not a strategy when your enemies have already agreed on the order in which you will be destroyed. In 660, Tang and Silla attacked Baekje. The campaign was designed around convergence. Tang forces under Su Dingfang came by sea toward Baekje's western approaches. Silla forces advanced from the east. If the two armies could link up, Baekje's position would become extremely difficult. The kingdom had to prevent that union before the capital was isolated. At this moment, later memory turns toward one of Baekje's most tragic military figures, Baekje. According to Korean historical tradition, Baekje led a much smaller Baekje force against the advancing Silla army near Hwangsambeol. The record surrounding him is shaped by later heroic memory, and some details should be treated with caution. But the broad outline is clear enough. Baekje tried to stop Silla before Silla could join the wider attack. It failed. Silla broke through. Tang pressed forward. Sabi, Baekje's capital, was now exposed. King Weija, the last ruling king of Baekje, could not hold the kingdom together. After the Allied advance reached the capital, he surrendered. The royal family and many elites were taken away to Tang territory. The court ceased to function. The state, as a recognized kingdom ruled from Sabi, was over. For many histories, that is the end of Baekje. A king surrenders. A capital falls. A dynasty ends. But conquest is rarely that clean on the ground. The collapse of a court does not instantly erase local loyalties. It does not make every fortress open its gates. It does not persuade every soldier that the old kingdom has ceased to matter. A state can die at the center while still resisting at the edges. That is what happened to Baekje. The fall of Sabi created a vacuum. Tang and Silla had won the capital, but they still had to secure the territory. Former officials, local commanders, and loyalist forces continued to resist. Some fought because they believed Baekje could be restored. Some fought because surrender meant ruin. Some may have fought because the new order had not yet proven it could govern. The restoration movement needed legitimacy. A rebellion can be crushed as disorder. A restoration can claim to be the return of a lawful kingdom. That distinction mattered. Baekje loyalists needed more than fortresses and weapons. They needed a royal name. They needed someone who could stand in for the kingdom that had fallen at Sabi. They chose Baekje. Baekje was a Baekje prince who had been in Yamato, Japan. Bringing him back gave the movement a dynastic center. It also deepened Yamato's involvement. If a Baekje prince returned from Japan with support, the restoration movement could present itself not as a local uprising, but as a serious attempt to reverse the outcome of 660. Why would Yamato take the risk? The answer lies in the long relationship between Baekje and the Japanese archipelago. Baekje's destruction threatened to remove a partner from the peninsula and leave Silla, backed by Tang, in a stronger position. For Yamato, that was not an abstract problem. It affected prestige, diplomacy, access to continental culture, and the security imagination of the archipelago. So Yamato sent aid. The exact scale and timing of that support are described differently across sources, and the numbers preserved in later records require caution. What can be said with confidence is that Yamato committed substantial resources to the Baekje restoration effort. This was not symbolic sympathy. It was military intervention. The war was no longer only about Baekje. It had become a test of whether a fallen kingdom could be revived with overseas support before a new regional order hardened around its defeat. The Baekje restoration began with a powerful idea. The kingdom was not dead if its people still fought and its royal line still lived. But ideas do not command armies by themselves. The restoration movement was fragile from the beginning. It brought together surviving Baekje officials, military leaders, local strongholds, a returning prince, and foreign support from Yamato. These groups shared a common enemy, but that did not mean they shared a single chain of command. Baekje carried royal legitimacy. Other men held military power. That difference was dangerous. Among the most important figures in the restoration was Baekje, often identified in the records as a leading Baekje loyalist commander. He had the ability to organize resistance and maintain pressure against Tang and Silla forces. Without commanders like him, the restoration would have been little more than a royal name and a memory. But a restoration movement can be torn apart by the very men who keep it alive. The record suggests that relations between Baekje and Baekje deteriorated badly. Baekje was eventually killed. The exact dynamics are difficult to reconstruct with certainty, and the surviving accounts come through hostile or later traditions. But the political meaning is clear. At the moment when Baekje needed unity, its leadership fractured. This was not a small internal dispute. A restored kingdom that has not yet restored itself cannot afford a crisis of trust. Every commander wonders whether the prince can lead. Every ally wonders whether the movement can survive. Every enemy sees the opportunity. Tang and Silla did not need Baekje loyalists to be helpless. They only needed them to be divided. The key stronghold became Juryu, often identified as one of the main centers of the restoration effort. It was not just a fortress. It was a symbol of whether Baekje still had a place from which to act as a political force. If Juryu held, the movement remained alive. If it fell, the restoration would lose its center. Yamato's intervention was aimed at changing that outcome. The Japanese fleet and Baekje restoration forces needed to relieve pressure on the loyalist strongholds and reconnect the movement's pieces. Geography made the task difficult. The forces had to operate through river and coastal routes in territory contested by Tang and Silla. A fleet that might look powerful at sea could become vulnerable in a river mouth where formation, timing, and local conditions mattered more than raw numbers. This is where Baekje became decisive. The battle was not fought because commanders wanted a dramatic naval showdown. It was fought because the restoration movement needed access, relief, and momentum. Yamato forces had to break through. Tang and Silla had to prevent them. If Yamato succeeded, Baekje might not have been restored immediately, but the war could continue. If Yamato failed, Baekje's last large external lifeline would be cut. By 663, the restoration movement had already spent 3 years trying to turn survival into revival. Baekje would decide whether that effort still had a future. The Battle of Baekje took place in 663 near the lower reaches of the Gyeom River, though the exact identification of ancient place names and modern geography has been discussed by historians. The setting mattered. This was not an open ocean battle in which a fleet could simply spread out and rely on numbers. A river mouth forces decisions. Ships must move through constrained waters. Formations become critical. Timing becomes unforgiving. A force trying to break through can be drawn into a place where its size becomes harder to use. On one side stood Tang and Silla. On the other stood Yamato Japan and the Baekje restoration forces. The Yamato side appears to have committed a large fleet, and later accounts emphasize the scale of the effort. But scale did not translate into victory. Tang naval forces held formation and blocked the attempt to break through. The battle turned disastrous for Yamato and Baekje. Many ships were destroyed or burned. The Allied restoration effort failed to reach its objective. The result was decisive. Baekje's restoration movement had depended on the possibility that help from across the sea could change the war. After Baekje, that possibility collapsed. Yamato could no longer rescue the movement. Tang and Silla could tighten their control. The remaining strongholds lost the strategic hope that had kept the restoration alive. Juryu fell soon after. Buyeo fled, reportedly to Goguryeo. The Baekje restoration was finished. This is why Baekje matters. The fall of Sabi in 660 ended Baekje as a functioning kingdom. The defeat at Baekje in 663 ended the possibility that Baekje could come back. Those are not the same thing. A kingdom can be conquered and still imagined as recoverable. A capital can fall, while loyalists continue to believe that time, legitimacy, and foreign support might reverse the outcome. For 3 years, Baekje existed in that space between death and disappearance. Baekje closed that space. For Baekje loyalists, the defeat meant that courage had not been enough. Royal blood had not been enough. Overseas friendship had not been enough. The world around Baekje had become too powerful, too coordinated, and too unforgiving. For Yamato Japan, the defeat was a shock. It revealed the danger of military intervention on the peninsula at a moment when Tang and Silla were reshaping the region. After Baekje, Yamato strengthened defenses at home and became more aware of the possibility that events on the continent could threaten the archipelago. The loss did not end Japanese engagement with continental culture, but it changed the strategic mood. For Silla, Baekje helped remove the last serious chance of Baekje's return. For Tang, it demonstrated the reach of imperial power across the sea, even if that reach would later prove more difficult to turn into permanent control. For Baekje, it was the final closing of a door that had remained open, however narrowly, after the capital fell. After Baekje's defeat, it might seem obvious who had won. Tang and Silla had destroyed Baekje's kingdom. Yamato had withdrawn. The restoration had failed. The map had changed, but victory created new problems. Tang and Silla had been allies because they shared enemies. That did not mean they shared the same future. Silla wanted to dominate the Korean peninsula. Tang wanted to impose an imperial order in the territories of defeated kingdoms. These goals could overlap during war, but they could not both be fully satisfied after victory. That tension became clearer after Goguryeo also fell in 668. With Baekje and Goguryeo gone, Silla no longer needed Tang in the same way. Tang, for its part, did not intend to let Silla simply inherit the peninsula. Conflict between the former allies followed. Silla eventually pushed Tang forces out of much of the peninsula and established what later historians call Unified Silla. This matters for understanding Baekje. Baekje's fall was not simply one step in a smooth process of unification. It was part of a chain of wars, betrayals, bargains, and reversals. Silla's alliance with Tang was both the key to its success and a danger to its independence. The same force that helped Silla destroy Baekje could later become Silla's rival. Silla won, but it won by playing a dangerous game. Tang won, but not in the way an empire always hopes to win. Yamato lost, but defeat forced it to rethink the security of the archipelago. Baekje lost most completely, but its disappearance reshaped everyone else's choices. That is often the hidden power of a fallen state. Even after it is gone, the space it occupied must be reorganized. Its allies must adjust. Its enemies must divide the prize. Its people must decide whether to submit, flee, resist, or rebuild their lives under new masters. Baekje's elites and refugees did not vanish. Some entered Tang custody. Some remained in the peninsula under the new order. Some crossed to Japan, where Baekje connections continued to matter in court memory and cultural history. The movement of people after Baekje's fall helped carry skills, lineages, texts, and stories across the sea. This is why Baekje's afterlife is so important. Politically, the kingdom ended. Culturally and historically, it continued to move. In Korea, Baekje remained one of the three kingdoms, remembered through archaeology, royal tombs, temple sites, fortress remains, and the memory of its refined culture. In Japan, Baekje occupied a special place in narratives of early continental influence and aristocratic lineage. In Chinese records, Baekje appeared within the framework of Tang diplomacy, conquest, and imperial order. Each tradition preserved Baekje differently. None of them preserved it neutrally. That is what happens to a kingdom after it loses the power to speak for itself. Its enemies record its defeat. Its allies remember its value. Its descendants search for traces. Later nations place it inside stories that Baekje itself could never have imagined. The kingdom was gone. The arguments over what it meant had only begun. Baekje's fall is often placed inside the story of Silla's unification of Korea. That is understandable. From the perspective of the peninsula's later political history, Baekje's defeat in 660 and Goguryeo defeat in 668 opened the way for Silla to dominate much of Korea. The larger pattern is real. But it can also flatten Baekje into a stepping stone. From Baekje's perspective, the story looks different. It is not a chapter on the road to someone else's unity. It is the end of a country that had moved capitals and survived, a country that had turned maritime diplomacy into political strength, a country that had helped transmit Buddhism and continental culture to Japan, a country that was defeated not because it had no history, but because the regional order around it changed faster than it could adapt. Baekje was destroyed by military force, but not by military force alone. It fell because Silla found a way to escape its southeastern limits. It fell because Tang could project power across the sea. It fell because Baekje's old rivalry with Silla had become impossible to manage. It fell because the restoration movement could not overcome internal fracture and external pressure at the same time. No single villain explains the fall. Not King Uija alone. Not one failed battle alone. Not one betrayal alone. The kingdom fell because every path narrowed. That is what makes the story tragic. Baekje still had resources. It had memory, legitimacy, fortresses, overseas allies, and men willing to fight. It was not erased in a single night. It was defeated in stages, first the capital, then the court, then the restoration, then the memory of itself as an independent political future. The final tragedy is that Baekje survived best in the records of others. Silla remembered it as a defeated rival. Tang remembered it as part of an imperial campaign. Japan remembered it as a lost partner and a source of continental prestige. Modern Korea remembers it as one of the three kingdoms, a civilization with its own art, diplomacy, and regional identity. All of these memories contain something true. None of them are the whole kingdom. When we look back at Baekje, the temptation is to treat its fall as inevitable. Silla was rising. Tang was powerful. Yamato was too far away. The restoration was divided. The river battle was lost. The kingdom could not return. But inevitability is usually something history writes after the fact. For the men fighting in the fortresses, for the envoys crossing the sea, for the prince returning from Yamato, for the commanders trying to hold the last strongholds, the future had not yet closed. They were not acting inside a completed story. They were trying to prevent the ending we now take for granted. That is why Baekje still matters, because it marks the moment when possibility became memory. After the fires on the river, Baekje did not come back as a state. Its name remained, but its sovereignty did not. Its people continued, but its court did not. Its culture traveled, but its kingdom was gone. So when did Baekje truly die? Was it in 660, when Sabi fell and King Uija surrendered? Was it in 663, when the Yamato fleet was destroyed and the restoration movement collapsed? Or was it later, when other powers finished deciding how Baekje would be remembered? The answer may be that Baekje died more than once. It lost its capital first. Then it lost its army. Then it lost the future its loyalists tried to restore. And finally, it lost the ability to tell the story of its own fall without passing through the voices of Silla, Tang, Japan, and later historians. Yet Baekje is not silent. Its ruins still stand in Korea. Its traces remain in Japan. Its fall still reveals how deeply connected East Asia already was in the 7th century. A kingdom on the southwestern Korean coast could fall, and the shock could reach Chang'an, Silla, and the Japanese archipelago. That is the real scale of Baekje's story. It was not just a vanished Korean kingdom. It was a state caught between 3 worlds: Tang power, Silla ambition, Yamato memory. And between them, Baekje disappeared from the map, but never fully from history.